Hello, and welcome to the virtual Fairfield Museum. The museum is closed right now to the public, but we're coming to you virtually through programs and opportunities online to learn a little bit more about the history of the town and its story. So today is the program Where's Walt? And I am Walt Matis. I work in the education department at the Fairfield Museum. My official title is Program and Volunteer Coordinator. So I work to make sure programs and volunteers and all that is put together when we're doing programs for the public. But today I'm here at Sturges Park to talk a little bit about the farming history and how some of that has come and gone through Fairfield's story. Now, when Fairfield is established in 1639, it starts as the Four Squares, and the Four Squares are the original settlement point. They actually come off of where Beach Road and the old Post Road actually cross one another. So those four squares is where the town, Roger Ludlow being the person who brings the first group of settlers here to Fairfield, that's where they settle. That's the original town center, if you will. From there, the town will actually grow to eventually, just before the American Revolution in the late 18th century, Fairfield will basically, its western boundary is the Saugatuck River, and then its eastern boundary is what is today Park Avenue, and then its southern boundary is Long Island Sound, and then the northern boundary would be roughly the Reading-Bethel line. So everything inside that today the towns of Reading, Weston, Easton, about 2/3 of Westport, the Black Rock section of Bridgeport, as well as Fairfield as we know it, was all the town of Fairfield. Now, just before the American Revolution, there's about 4,500 people living within the town. Now, sometimes, people ask, well, what are they doing? They have all that, land. Well, most of them are farmers. Well into the 19th century, 8 out of 10 people who live in Fairfield are farmers. So that's 80% of the population. And many of the people, even that weren't specifically farmers, owned large chunks of land that they either would farm part-time or would lease out to other people to farm for them. So just to put that into some perspective, we get some numbers, roughly 1681, where that gives acreage and the amount of acreage. And it's roughly 98 individuals, families probably connected, but at least 98 that are connected, that are on this list. And the largest landowner is a gentleman by the name of Thomas Staples, and he owns a little over 1,100 acres. Now, these aren't necessarily contiguous, they're not all necessarily touching each other, but within the total community, he's got a little over 1,100 acres. The smallest is a gentleman by the name of Samuel Godwin, and that he has about 121 acres. So that's the extremes of the ownership of land. But even the smallest is still over 100 acres. And if you do, just some quick math, that averages out to about 500 acres per family for each one of them. So farming is a huge part of Fairfield's history. In the early days, in the 18th century, corn, rye is a primary crop, flax, which gets turned into linen, and the seeds actually become something called linseed oil, which is a component of paint in the 18th century. It's used for other things, but it's very important for the seeds in that sense. There are orchards. Fairfield does get known for its apples at certain points. And also some of that land is, of course, for animals and livestock, horses, cows, sheep, all of those type of animals. So farming is a huge part of that early history. And Sturges Park, this area, was part of that larger farming story. So we know at one point it's known as the Mount David Farm, or even known as the John Bulkley Upland Farm. When it's Mount David Farm, it actually belongs to the Sturges family, and in that time frame. And you can see in the distance, you can see Carolyn Hospital, and that's going to be built later. That's going to come along in about 1954. But the Sturges family actually owns all of this. For those who kind of know where I am, actually all the way to Fairfield University, parts of Fairfield University, where Bellarmine is, and some of that property actually was Sturges property, as well as across and towards Mill River from where I am right now. So the other thing, though, and part of the reason why I wanted to mention Carolyn Hospital, is that the Trinity Church, the Anglican Church, originally is located at the far end, basically, of Sturges Field, starting in 1725. Now, the parish was probably meeting before that, anywhere up to 10 years, maybe a little bit more, but they were meeting in people's homes. Their first church, their first actual structure, is actually built there or opens there in 1725. And they are located there, as is their burying ground, until 1737, at which time the congregation has grown, and they actually moved to the center of town, which, as I said before, is closer to where Beach Road and Old Post Road is. In fact, the church, Trinity Church, at that time is actually built at the intersection of what is today Old Post Road and Oldfield Road. So that's where the church is in 1737. Now, that structure is destroyed in 1779 during the raid by General Tryon during the American Revolution. So when that structure is burned, the parish, the church, continues to meet, but once again, primarily in private homes. And they do that until 1790. So for roughly 10 years, they're meeting in private homes or other locations, at which time they return to Mill Plain. And they have a third structure that's built here. And they remain here until 1829. 1829, they will actually have a chapel built in Southport. Now, it is my understanding that there was a group of Episcopalians that were actually meeting in Southport that were already connected to Trinity Church during that window of 1790 to roughly 1829. But in 1829, they actually moved the parish to Southport. They actually built a chapel on Rose Hill, and Trinity Church will remain in Southport after that time. In 1840, the Jonathan Sturges Cottage is built, which is about a half to 3/4 mile from where I'm standing right now. And Jonathan Sturges was a businessman in New York, a merchant, and he had a cottage built here. Sometimes people will say, well, it's a little bit big for a cottage. The original structure was smaller, although it was still pretty good size, but it was also added onto or changed between in 1846, 1883, and 1895. So it was enlarged to some degree. But it was his home when he wasn't in New York doing business. And they owned a great deal of the property on the other side of Mill Plain Road. This side, Sturges Park, belonged to Frederick Sturges, and he had this. We know that he continued to run it as a farm from 1878 to 1890, at which time Frederick Sturges Jr., his son, will also run and maintain to some degree. But in 1946, Frederick Sturges Jr. will actually donate this piece of property, roughly 12 acres, to the town of Fairfield to be a park for the town. For those of us, who grew up here, softball, soccer today, arguably to this side, one of the best sledding hills in all of Fairfield is actually here in Sturges Park. And then in 1948, Frederick Sturgis will actually donate the land on the other side of this hill here, the hill that is good for sledding, right? On the other side, he will donate another 19 acres of land for what will be the site originally of the Mill Plains School, which will open in 1951. But today is actually the location of Fairfield Ludlow High School and Roger Ludlow Middle School. So that acreage, which was also part of the Sturgis property, was brought into the fold. And as I said before, in 1954, Carleton Hospital opens. And then in 1958, just beyond Carleton, is the I-95, and that will open in 1958, just beyond there. But one of the more interesting moments in the history of Sturgis Park, arguably, happened in August of 2006. The town of Fairfield was working to put in a irrigation system here in the park, and as they were digging, they found remains, bones, if you will. And they stopped digging, and they brought in originally the police, and they brought them in so that they could check and make sure that it wasn't something that they needed to be worried about. And so after they determined that it wasn't a scene that needed to be investigated, they called in, at that time, Nick Bellantoni, the state archaeologist. And what they discovered is, if you remember, I had mentioned that there was a church, the Trinity Church was there, and they had a burying ground. And they had actually had burials there. Now, we know that in 1881, a group of stones were actually put into the old burying ground on Beach Road. They were actually brought there. We know that two of them, the Applegates, were actually from a piece of private property. Those graves, that's those stones. But there were 5 stones that were brought from the old from the burying ground of Trinity Church. And there was some discussion about whether or not the bodies as well as the stones had been moved. And what it seems is that perhaps they were not, because those were the remains, we believe, that were discovered in 2006, is that they found 2 male, 1 female, and they were able to bring them out. They were studied. There were some attempts to identify using names of descendants of the Trinity Church, and to see if they could identify. They weren't able to, so the remains all remain unidentified. But in 2008, the remains were brought to Trinity Church in Southport, which is the descendant church of the original church that was here in 1725. And they were interred there. In fact, they actually used the 1662 Book of Prayer. So they were actually using the original words and prayers that would have been used in the period of the 18th century when those burials would have been made at that time. So I hope that you've enjoyed this Where's Walt episode. If you did, I have to be honest, as I said, the museum's closed to the public, but you can show support by becoming a member, making donations. It would be greatly appreciated. You can go to our website, fairfieldhistory.org, and follow links there to find out how you can help support. You can also find links to some of the other virtual programs that we're doing. So we have pretty much a program almost every day. So some of them are actual individuals from the museum. Others are written, cool anecdotes and things about the town. So great way to enjoy that. All right, so I'd like to say thank you very much, and hope you've enjoyed, and I hope to see you on the History Trail. Take care. Bye.